with the discussions. Just an important point is that what we are going to discuss today is a framework which intends to have direct applicability within member states' law, and which is actually intended to be a standard setting exercise aiming to provide a comprehensive harmonization in the field of AI products in the market. So with this spirit, what we are going to discuss today is giving a high-level overview of the main provisions of the AI Act, how the holistic regulation fits with the governance and rules of other areas such as medical devices, as well as technical tools and architectures, considering essential requirements for high-risk systems, and finally, how that fits within the ecosystem of trust. So I'm going to give the floor directly to Burkhard.
Okay, thank you. And I had prepared a little bit more than I will have time to do, so I will probably skip over a couple of these provisions. Just a very general introduction. Firstly, important to remember, it is a proposed regulation by the EU Parliament. It is not yet enacted. It might never happen. I mean, it generated lots and lots of excitement, but just to bear in mind that this is not yet law. One of the reasons for the excitement is that it is one of the first truly sector-independent proposals, not just restricted to one regulated field, very similar in that respect, like the GDPR, and going indeed further than the GDPR because the police is and law enforcement is explicitly included. The only exception, the one most important one, is arguably the military. And it lays down harmonized rules for the development, placement on the market, and also the use of AI systems. So all three stages in varying degrees are covered. It's also important, and that's one of the things that I find interesting, and that will be an important part, I think, of the research, part of a general reform framework. That act doesn't stand alone. It's part of a whole bundle of measures to enhance the digital economy. There's a Digital Services Act, a Digital Markets Act, a draft machinery regulation, a proposed product liability revision also relating to AI, and the Data Governance Act, which is particularly important, I would say, in the medical field again. So we have to understand these things probably in their interconnection, and at least on first look, they do pull potentially into different directions. Some of them seem to create true synergies, but others potentially create conflict and different value implementations in there. So one challenge will be to move beyond a system that focuses on compliance with a single act or with a single standard, and to see how we can model and understand how a product is affected by a multiplicity of regulatory frameworks, some of them potentially at least inconsistent with the others. The competency under which that act comes, Daria mentioned that is Article 114 on the function of the European Union. And that means it is primarily a free movement act. And very closely aligned also to product liability laws, but with a sprinkling, at least, of fundamental rights concerns. So it tries to do two things. It tries to reduce trade barriers, and that's its main function, I would say. But it does so by saying, okay, trade barriers are legitimately reduced if everyone agrees at least on some basic fundamental rights in that process. And we will see a little bit later how that potentially is in itself problematic. For both Brexit UK, that matters because just like the GDPR, it has at least some extraterritorial reach. If AI services are provided, if European Union citizens are affected by service providers, there's an extraterritorial element to it. It also doesn't supersede simply, is not superseded simply by the GDPR and its adequacy findings. So even though the UK has adequacy findings for data protection purposes, that does not necessarily translate directly to the AI Act. And there's actually, as far as I can see, no real mechanism to determine what happens if there is a cross-border conflict. It's very likely, given the significance of the European market, that commercial UK developers will at least have a look at this and see if adherence to these standards makes sense. And at the same time, as I mentioned this morning, there are similar initiatives in the US in particular. So the danger to fall between two big regulatory blocks. And again, also for our purposes, it's simply also a interesting case study to see what experience other places make in that attempt to get a more comprehensive regulatory regime. Very quickly, the basic structure, we are distinguishing here between, it's a risk-based approach. There are 4 categories of risk: unacceptable, these are things that are outright prohibited; high risk, significantly regulated; limited risk, more lightly regulated; and then those with a minimal risk, where you only have recommended codes of practice, and it all becomes quite soft. The important thing here for some, and that is indeed where the human rights aspect and the free market aspect come together, is the difference between the high risk and the limited risk ones. So for the high risk ones, we find significant regulation, potentially at least, but that comes at the cost of almost none for the more limited and minimal risk, and potentially the prohibition on member states to regulate in addition to what the Act provides on their own. So we potentially face a situation that member states who would like to have additional regulation, especially for limited and minimal risk applications, will be prevented by that Act. And that raises, again, for me, a sort of more general question about democracy and democratic accountability, responsiveness to local problems. There is a real tension here to the extent in which devolved parliaments, devolved powers are still able to respond to their voters and to their accountability. Unacceptable risks, generally prohibited. Looking at these, they seem to be something that is slightly more informed by science fiction than by reality. There are slightly strange ideas about covert manipulation, and a relatively limited group. However, facial recognition, at least some facial recognition, is prohibited unless used for law enforcement. Another thing that is prohibited, I call it the "We are not China" provision, are certain forms of social scoring, if done by public authorities. But private authorities can still do whatever they want. And in particular, it generates of importance for our project a trustworthiness score, or that creation of a trustworthiness score is very often prohibited. Again, there's a sort of intersection of law, trust, and technology. I'm very quickly going through this. High-risk systems, they are the ones that are really of interest, the ones people focus on, are those that pose high risk to health, safety, and fundamental rights. And that brings 2 of our case studies, the health system and I would say driving into the scope. At least if you would allow me to drive, that would have serious safety consequences for everyone, and that's why I don't. And also if they are already part of an already regulated system, such as medical devices, or in one of these categories. And again, I would say the management and operation of critical infrastructures is the part where quite a bit of traffic systems, autonomous vehicles would fit in. High-risk systems generally permitted, but subject to safeguards and standards. I won't say a lot about this here. There's lots and lots of details here about the roles that manufacturers have to comply with. However, the concern that quite a bit of this is a little bit marking your own homework. There will be a new standard, a sort of CE mark that AI products will carry. And again, we have the problem that we mentioned this morning, that this potentially treats AIs too much as objects, as solid things, rather than something that is more fluid. Creation of a quality management system, documented risk management, data quality criteria, all, if you look at the prima facie text, quite demanding, quite steep obligations. However, the devil quite possibly will be in the detail on how these are enforced and what exactly is needed to show that one is compliant with them sufficiently and in view of their intended purposes. There is an obligation to assure systems against biases. That was one interesting part for me. Article 15, for the first time, takes this notion of bias directly into the heart of the regulation. And it also creates, at least for high-risk systems, an exception to the GDPR. It is now allowed to use your own data to check if your system is biased in the process, again, processing sensitive data of the people affected by it. Here we see this sort of sometimes problematic interaction between these different regulations, GDPR and all of these others. Here's, I think, a positive correlation between them. There are obligations for human oversight, which includes interfaces. I think Lachlan will talk about these a little bit. That event also involve event logging for certain applications, more detailed ones, for ICE principle, for biometric identification, and so on and so forth. And as I said before, a very strong role of standards, and with that a problem for democracy and who is accountable for these standards and the standard setting. One question that we had earlier this morning was, do they see things too much as an object? I think what is interesting here is the market control and enforcement. So an important role for market surveillance authorities, and that comes from product liability law. So there is now a system in place, or to put into place, that consistently evaluates and collects data and sees if there are problems. And with that, also a new database of high-risk systems. So quite a bit of the interesting parts, but also the problematic ones, we will still have to decide on the details, is on who is in that database and under which conditions they have to be updated if something changes. So that's me, very quick, very high-level overview, and on to the next person.
That's likely.
Is it me or Phoebe? Sorry, I wasn't sure.
Phoebe, I think.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, Phoebe.
Okay. I thought it's Lachlan.
I can go if you want.
Oh, that's fine. I can go. And can you see my screen?
No.
Okay. Let me check. Okay. So can you see the screen? Yeah. So I'm going to talk about a medical device regulation. And let me check. I don't seem to make it move. I don't seem to. Okay, can you see the screen?
No.
No.
Let me check. Okay, it's coming up now.
Ah, no,
Yes,
no,
now.
no, we
Okay,
can.
lovely. So I'm going to go through quickly about the regulation on medical device and looking into the comparison between the US FDA approach and as well as the EU or / UK approach here. So basically, I'm going to go through the article that has been published in the Digital Medicine last year, and which already identified the majority of the AI-based medical device has been used in radiology. Obviously, the pipe here is not really accurate. And then secondly, it is used in cardiology. And thirdly, there were different applications in internal medicine, neurology, ophthalmology, emergency medicine, and oncology. And this is the chart that I think is really interesting to look into different field of application in AI and medicine. And one of the case study that we are going to look into is the AI diagnosis of diabetic retinopathy. So this is the first AI diagnostic system that use the algorithm to decide whether the patient have high possibility of diabetic retinopathy. So this is totally autonomous, that you don't really need a clinical professional to conduct this, this checkup. So it could really use quite broadly without limitation. And this is basically an AI algorithm used to analyze the images taken from the eye with a retinal camera. So it will follow by an autonomous screen decision. But this decision is not 100% accurate or safe. So you can see sometimes you come up with false negative and sometimes false positive. And the thing is, it followed the FDA de novo pathway, which means that the technology is new and very novel, but introduce a low to moderate risk that is easily to mitigate. Then we want to ask, how do we compensate those risks arising from those false negative patients? So this has traditionally been managed from two dimensions. The first one is the pre-market pathway, the pre-market control. The second one will be the post-market, where we will talk about liability issue and responsibility issue, and how do we do insurance or compensation for those patients that have been diagnosed wrongly. And the FDA also, upon granting all this kind of AI diagnostic or AI medical device, they also issue more specific technical action plan for some standards or some guidance. For example, there is algorithm change protocol and predetermined change control plan. So in those kind of detail, you can set out some of the updating process of the software should not receive another approval, market approval, and there will be more technicality explaining how is a safety risk or a safety being construed. And interestingly, they also use, if you see the bottom one, real world performance. So you have to really cast the software into the real world performance. You need to analyze or follow up the whole product life cycle approach to not only predict, but also follow up the whole product life cycle, so that we can have a better grasp of the risk or safety profile of this algorithm. And follow up from the Berkeley's introduction on the AI regulation, we know that there are 4 types of risks. So more normally, the AI use medical diagnosis algorithm, they are high risk medical device or medical products here. There will be different forms of market approval or conformity assessment, and there will be also different types of liability implications. So in addition to AI Act, which is more the generic or general approach looking into all the software or algorithm aspect, and in the EU, we also have the new medical device regulation. It's fairly new, so it has already strengthened the monitoring and surveillance aspect of the safety of the product. Especially, it also gives some redefinition of medical device software as medical device. So you can see there are different aspects, and looking into how to define the new risk of product, new risk classification for medical device. And there is also strengthening of post-market surveillance for manufacturers. In the UK, there is also for post-market monitoring procedure. So we can look at the MHRA website. They have already also published a lot of guidance for manufacturers on vigilance. And most importantly, you can see a list of different incident report that has to associate with different type of medical device. So we can see here a list of different, perhaps is more relevant. Here's insulin infusion pumps, for example, is also a very intrusive medical device that where an incident arise that the manufacturer needs to report back. And finally, for the last session, I'm going to talk about post-market also kind of compensation, and where we talk about product liability. So as Berker mentioned, the whole AI governance or regulation is literally revamp the whole digital regulation ecosystem. So product liability is one of the key things that they have to redefine, because obviously it is difficult to describe software as a product, as you couldn't really see or couldn't really hold it in like an object. So it has been always in debate whether software or CAD file or blueprint, a CAD blueprint will be a kind of product, or and any error or any corruption from this algorithm will be defined as defect, product defect, so that it could use this product liability regime. Currently, it is not able to be seen as a product so far. Most precedents see algorithms or software as service because of its intangible nature. But now we can see that is a gap in the product liability regime. That's why we, the legislators, they want to redefine or reevaluate the product liability directive. And here, we also need to ask whether autonomous behavior of a robot can be a defect. And here we can see this will be quite a big element to unpack. If it's a defect, then obviously manufacturer will be held responsible. And another question is how can the strict liability rule to allocate it onto different stakeholders? Because obviously here we have when an AI diagnosis or AI autonomous system in autonomous car, there have been a lot of multiple participants in the production chain. And how do we allocate or redistribute, demarcate the liability to specific personnel? And it's difficult to clarify liability at every different level of automation. Last year, these laws are fairly new. This is one of those new ones. Last year, the European Parliament issued a resolution on civil liability for AI, which basically was saying that there is strict liability application for high-risk AI system. So yes, for those 4 types, the second high-risk AI could receive high-risk strict liability protection. But for other weaker or not risky or lower risk AI system, we will need to follow the fault-based liability. So in other words, consumers or patients still need to prove there is a defect in the algorithm or in the product or in the diagnosis. And finally, in academic debate, there are different schools of thought. For example, in the left column, there's a scholar looking into expanding the group of liability. So his argument would be widening the circle of responsible actors. For example, now it's not easy to hold computer software developers responsible, but his opinion would be we would need to include those agents as one of the responsible actors. And another school of thought is in the right-hand column is looking into civil liability to financial management of losses. So, which means that we need to look into more of a financial management system to recompensate or to recoup the damage. We are not looking into attribution of individual faults or liability because sometimes it's impossible and it's not efficient and not necessary because basically this is all group work and the process of identifying who is the culprit would be really like impossible. So this will be upcoming work need to be keep an eye on. So just watch the space and thank you for your time. And Chris, you are next.
Definitely Lapland this time.
Yes.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. Okay, can people see my screen okay? Yeah, screen visible? Let's see my screen. Okay, I'll trust it's visible, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you, Burkhard and Phoebe, for those really interesting talks. Some of my talk, to be fair, does cover similar ground to Burkhard's, but I'll try not to dwell on points that have been covered too much already. So my talk is going to give a bit of a tour of some of the provisions within the AI Act, and in particular thinking about how some of these intersect potentially with design practices and the ways they might implicate design processes around trustworthy autonomous systems. But before going on to the AI Act, I wanted to kind of briefly just contextualise, where it's come. Well, some other work that's kind of matches this from different perspectives. So I just wanted to briefly flag that there's been a bit of debate as to does it make sense to talk of trustworthy AI, trustworthy autonomous systems in the first place? And some scholars have been arguing we should focus more on the kind of institutions and not so much on the systems themselves. And I think it's interesting the EU approach is kind of, at least in the AI Act, is looking at both the systems and the organisations who are deploying these systems and providing guidelines for both. And prior to the release of the AI Act, there had been a lot of work done within the EU high-level expert group, focusing more on the ethics side of how we can perhaps move towards building more trustworthy systems. And for them, they've documented quite a wide range of different recommendations, which some scholars have been critical of them being perhaps too wide in their remit. But I think it's interesting, nonetheless, just to present some of the examples to show some of the different types of technical and non-technical tools that they are anticipating being valuable in going towards trying to build more trustworthy systems. So things around some of the discussions today have been around explainable AI, which is one of their priority areas. There's been stuff around quality of service indicators, which focus on things around functionality and performance, usability, and security, which links back to Andy's talk this morning. On the technical side. And then on the non-technical side, trying to utilise tools that are maybe more familiar on the regulatory side, from codes of conduct, standards, things that Phoebe and Burkhard have mentioned, impact assessments, And also this emphasis on trying to regulate across the life cycle of products and services, and trying to look at the governance within organisations and the role that different actors can play within the management structures of organisations as well. So I thought it was useful just to kind of give a bit of background of a kind of complementary body of literature to the AI Act. But so yeah, some of this may cover what Burkhardt's looked at, but in any case, we'll go through it. So yeah, I think it's important that, as Burkhard mentioned, there's a degree of extraterritoriality envisioned in the Act. So even if it's mainly geared towards member states of the EU, I think UK organisations that want access to that marketplace will still need to think about the regulation and what it's trying to put in place. Something that's quite important is certain provisions within the legislation, particularly Articles 5 and 10, have quite significant fines attached to them if you're not complying with them. And I think there's something interesting in the way that the regulation focuses on the intended purpose and the intended use of the technology as opposed to how it's actually used in practice, and how this to an extent perhaps limits some of the questions of liability and non-compliance which may arise if you kind of focus on some of those more unintended uses as well. And again, as Burkhard had mentioned, there's different tiers within the regulation that look at different levels of risk and different types of systems that may be so problematic that they're prohibited. But even those ones that are prohibited, you look at the live facial recognition provision, it actually caveats quite a lot of applications where it can still be used. Social crediting, which isn't necessarily something that's used anyway so far in Europe. You've got high-risk AI systems, which is where a lot of our interest from the node will be. In particular, I think Burkhard mentioned that there is use of AI in existing regulated products, and mentioned obviously the medical side, which Phoebe's looked at too, but I think there's also mention in the legislation around AI within civil aviation, within motor vehicles, which I think perhaps capture some of our other use cases that we're interested in, and the way in which the legislation tries to capture sort of safety critical uses of AI where there may be risks to health and safety if those systems don't work as intended. And then the lower risk systems, they're primarily transparency requirements, so they need to inform subjects that they're actually they're interacting with an AI system. And some of my other work, I do another project looking at motion sensing technologies. These are covered under this particular part. And I think there's some interesting implications there from an interaction design perspective as to how do you make it clear to someone that they're interacting with an AI system, and the law kind of says, well, you don't have to do that if it's obvious, but determining when it is or isn't obvious, I think there's some work to do there. And then obviously the codes of practice for minimal systems. And to me, what's interesting about the approach in the AI Act is the way that it does try to kind of define system requirements and design requirements for high-risk AI systems in particular. And we have a range of these within the legislation. I won't go through these in detail, but there are these kind of data governance requirements around quality criteria for making sure that you're using training data sets that don't have missing data, that address bias concerns, and making sure that you have sufficient technical documentation before something goes in the marketplace to show that you've put in place sufficient safeguards and measures to deal with any risks, to try and make sure there's record keeping and logs from when these systems are being used in practice. I think there's also those interesting points around the sort of security dimension, which again links into some of Andy's work that he was finding this morning. And something I think is quite interesting is around the sort of human oversight dimensions here, where there is the need to put in place appropriate human-machine interface tools, which is something I'll come back to shortly. And I think what these sets of requirements point towards is the fact that there is a lot of need for cooperation, like we're trying to do within the node, and bringing together different communities to operationalize some of these provisions and really understand what it actually means to put in place verification systems, or what do we need to be looking at from the regulatory perspective in terms of quality of data sets. What types of risk assessment systems should we be putting in place, and how can we do that building on bodies of knowledge from other domains that have been doing it for a long time, insurance industry and actuaries. So beyond trying to obviously put in place these requirements for the systems themselves, there's also within the law a focus on the different stakeholders across the supply chain, the providers, the users, importers, the distributors, and trying to get them involved, obviously, in these processes of conformity assessments, which Burkhard had mentioned, and before things go in the market, having CE marks that we're maybe more familiar with from electrical goods and those settings. And again, just trying to have a bit more of a holistic approach where, if something happens, a particular system should no longer be approved under those CE marks, trying to kind of feed that down and make sure that it's reflected at different points in the supply chain, so that others are aware of it and can stop using it or fix it or withdraw the system. And I think for me, with my kind of design interests aside as well, I think there's quite some interesting language in the legislation around the role for interaction design and kind of calling on different processes, which I thought were unusual to see within a piece of legislation like this. This talk of needing to have continuous iterative processes throughout the lifetime of products, calling towards perhaps more agile and DevOps type processes. There was stuff in there around ensuring that there's participation from wider stakeholder groups and making sure that their needs are reflected in the design and development of AI systems, and also trying to look towards the contextual factors of the setting where you need to draw on knowledge in the environment in which the system's intended to be used, which I think links to some of the more ethnographic type of work we're also doing within the node. I'm sure I'm running out of time, but I'll try and wrap it up. Just got a couple more slides. So I think something that's interesting about the legislation is trying to future-proof itself to a large extent. So I think someone was asking about, does it define AI? And it does attempt to provide a definition of AI, which is to a degree modular, that can be updated over time through the structure of the legislation, where they've got annexes that can be changed. And this is to try and guard against redundancy, which we've seen in other pieces of technology-focused legislation in the past. So I think that element's quite interesting. And I think I wanted to try and just draw a couple of these provocations that I've mentioned, that Andy had mentioned in the morning, which I think are things that would be useful to think about within the node more generally. So, I think within the legislation, there are these kind of prescriptive functional design requirements around data quality and those kinds of obligations that I mentioned. But I don't think it is so good at the kind of non-functional side of things and how we design to kind of make systems that respect human rights in a broader sense. So there could be this disconnect between the compliance with the legislation and these kind of wider questions of building trustworthy systems in society as a whole. I think there's a lot to be done in terms of thinking about human oversight systems and looking back at some of the explainable AI discussions earlier today, thinking about different types of users who might have different needs from these human oversight systems, from experts to non-experts. So I think that's something that there could be some work to pick up on. The nature of technical documentation that's required for these systems, I think, is another challenge. Perhaps it assumes more text-based, but I think there's other ways that we can maybe represent how the system is complying with the legislation through more architecture-orientated types of approaches, which is some work. That paper there, Andy, myself, and Tom Lodge had looked at that and how we could perhaps use system architecture as a way of demonstrating compliance. And just the last one, the breadth of requirements in terms of putting in place risk and quality management systems for high-risk AI systems is quite significant. And I think there's a lot of work there to think through how these can be implemented and operationalized. And so there's a lot to dig through there. So thank you for listening, and I'm sure I've gone over time, so apologies for that, but that's a couple of papers that are looking at aspects of the AI Act in different contexts, which might be of relevance for people as well. But thank you for your time.
That sets me up quite nicely. So Burkhard asked me to make sure that I talk a bit about the political economy of what's going to happen to this in the European Parliament and in the European institutions. And Alan's already actually asked the most important question, which is when can we get sued for this? And I gave him, of course, the typical lawyer's answer of it depends, but it actually depends on what happens to this thing in the European Parliament. So as Burkhard said, this is a draft from the European Commission, which is now being debated in the European institutions. And it's still actually very early in the process of actually going through those steps. And of course, it does have interplay with other laws, including actually some of the laws that affect the regulation of the biggest technology companies through things like the Digital Markets Act. So we have those things going on. So I'm going to say, this is deliberately provocative and I'll only be 10 minutes or so. So what I'm going to really say, and I'm just going to set my stopwatch to make sure it's only 10 minutes or so. So what I'm going to say is designed really just to get us thinking about what the Parliament is thinking as it's going through this. And the first thing is that we all know about this problem that we have in terms of legislation always has a pacing problem following technological change. And of course, legislation is a political problem. And some of the things that I've worked on in the past look at some of the areas like railway regulation, but also you can go back to the Corn Laws for those of you who remember your agricultural history of Britain, or indeed your history of the colonization of Ireland. So we know there's always a problem in technological versus political change. And Lachlan and Burkhard have done a really good job of explaining this is essentially what's being done, as Phoebe was saying as well, high-risk systems versus other systems and the types of approach that are needed. Okay, I just want you to all note that during the pandemic, the European Parliament's been very alert to things like this. Everyone may remember this ACM tweet saying face masks are a problem because it slows down the development of facial recognition. Well, that didn't go well. As opposed to this, which is my favorite stats tweet coming out of the early part of the pandemic, which is about nerd immunity. If we can convince others to understand that you should wear a mask, it could actually reduce disinformation about the pandemic. So there is a lot of concern amongst populations about distrust of their government and distrust of technology. And we need to be aware of the fact that we're living in a pandemic world where that's very, very clearly an issue that politicians are reflecting from their constituents, including the European Parliament. This is a smallpox vaccine cartoon from about 1930. This is actually from 1933, Credit World, the danger of having algorithmic decisions to deny you loans. So we know this has been going on for a long time, and the same distrust is going to be reflected in the European Parliament's approach to it. Politicians really care about AI, particularly because they care about disinformation and other things. And in the UK, we live in a world in which we know that our Secretary of State dealing with something called the Online Safety Bill that's coming up is somebody who herself has been guilty of sending, should we say, some angry tweets in the past. And this is her being cross-examined last week in the British Parliament over her tweets. So be aware that regulators know what's going on, and they even have had a bingo card for a couple of years looking at algorithmic accountability and trying to work out what it is that experts are trying to tell them. And they also are very concerned about trolley problem, not in the sense that the rest of us are, but really because they're just trying to entirely avoid any mess happening at all. And they tend to see the AI industry through the people that they see in front of them in committee meetings, like, of course, Mark Zuckerberg. So do be aware that the AI Act itself will be influenced by debates the European Parliament's having with, for instance, yesterday, Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, was appearing in the Parliament and with the Commission. So just be aware of this going on. It's worth saying, by the way, that particularly GAFAM are terrible, wasteful lobbyists. They're really poor at dealing with parliamentarians, tending to accuse them of technological ignorance, which is not a way of convincing anybody to listen to your discussion. And in particular, they're very bad at explaining the dangers of dual-use technologies and how they should be used. I haven't really got time to go over this in detail, but politicians are very aware of some of these things, including, for instance, the misuse of biometric databases. And we all, of course, are aware that recently there was a change of regime in Afghanistan, and that led to a very unfortunate change of the ownership of the database, which had been set up to enroll Afghans in biometric identity. So I'm just giving you an example of what the politicians are aware of in terms of potential misuses of, in this case, biometrics, but obviously wider uses of AI to help to target populations. Let me also just give you a bit of broader background. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights just released a report called The Right to Privacy in the Digital Age recently. It talks about human rights standards being applied to artificial intelligence. When it says digital age, this report is really about artificial intelligence. And it calls for something like the AI Act. But I'll say something like the AI Act, because I'll explain what the problem is with the AI Act, at least as promulgated by the European Commission in broad terms. It should be said, by the way, the United Nations report doesn't define what AI is. I've already said in the chat that the AI Act in the European space also doesn't define what AI what AI is. The OECD tries to, but the definitions that are used are pretty poor so far. The report from the UN recognizes problems with particularly high risk AI, and it talks in particular about things like biometric identification. It talks about the need for human rights impacts to be analyzed, including the right to individual privacy. Again, this is very different to some of the previous work that's been done. It talks about some of the shaky scientific foundations of some proposals for things like facial recognition systems being rolled out live. And so we need to be aware of that. And it suggests a precautionary principle to high-risk AI. So far, is relatively straightforward to compare. And it's worth saying, by the way, I would refer to the worst tweet ever. The ACM have apologized for the tweet that was put out about Marston facial recognition. And they've explained that they will move on. But of course, damage was done to some extent. So the European Commission's proposal has been much criticized by the European Parliament already. And it's anyone's guess as to when it will become law. It's unlikely to be something that's seen anywhere near a court before 2023, 2024, could be later. IMCO is the committee responsible for the AI Act, and that's being chaired by the S&D group, which is essentially the kind of equivalent to the Labour Party in other countries. It's also being dealt with by the Telecoms Council of Ministers in the European Council of Ministers. So Slovenia is chairing that at the moment. There is a nice little graphic there. There's a legislative train that illustrates where we're going to. It's worth saying that there are some unusual things, unusual things if you think that they're deliberate or accidental emissions. Big tech doesn't really get regulated directly in this, except in as much as there are high-risk systems. User rights, and by this I'm not talking about the companies deploying AI, but the users who are affected by those AI systems in the wild, don't have rights as such. There isn't even a general requirement to inform people that they're undergoing AI-based decisions. Algorithmic fairness is not something which comes up here. It may come up in other laws, and of course there could be amendments taking place here. And it's also worth saying that the conformity assessments are essentially internal processes in the AI Act as things stand. So it's as I've suggested in the chat, it's a minimum harmonization, and as Burkhard said as well, it's not designed to give end users rights that have teeth to sue those who are deploying AI. That's not the intention, at least from the European Commission's draft. And again, please do remember, that's the draft being debated currently by both the member states in the Council and by the European Parliament. Okay, so it's not universally well regarded by regulatory lawyers because some of us were quite excited about an AI Act, and of course, to call it an AI Act, you're probably already, all of you realizing that the hype is probably a little more than the actual instrument. And I've called it essentially product safety sponsorship of the single market in AI, which is sort of what it is. So that the four objectives, this is from the memorandum that accompanies explaining the AI Act itself. It's more really about legal certainty to facilitate investment in innovation than it is about fundamental rights and union values, at least as it currently stands. This is what the S&D group think, just to let you know what the European Parliament's IMCO committee is likely to say. And this is there actually from yesterday. You can see there, that is Frances Horgan on the left, the whistleblower. On the right is Christel Schaldemose, who's one of the MEPs responsible, actually not for the AI Act dossier, which is responsible for the Digital Services Act, which is alongside it. They say that they are concerned about the way in which big tech is going to use these things. That will very much play into the Digital Services Act. It may also play into their views on the AI Act itself as well. And they are very much marching with pitchforks towards facial recognition, at least live facial recognition, which may be a real issue. Okay, so AI Act is very interesting. It has no individual or collective enforcement mechanism, and it's been suggested by friends who are critical of the AI Act that it will most likely not be enforced. It's not going to be anything remotely as affecting of of commercial deployment as the GDPR. The GDPR itself, by the way, was massively overhyped in terms of how much it affects companies' ability to deploy systems that involve personal data. It's very unlikely that this act itself is going to put a very major burden on companies, but actually once this act is in place, it will be at least a decade, possibly a much longer period before anything will unravel it. So for those interested in whether or not this will damage European AI, it's very unlikely as it's currently drafted, because it's a fairly minimal idea. But for those who are excited about the rights of individual users, i.e. the people affected by AI decision-making, to be able to bring court cases actually trying to challenge the way that AI is being deployed, that's extremely unlikely. So depending on which side of that argument about the regulation of AI you sit, you may decide that this is either a storm in a teacup or actually a very useful, very minimal form of regulation. So that's me being provocative, and others are very welcome to disagree with what are broad-based suggestions for what the draft looks like at the moment. I think it will become a little bit more interesting going forward. I think that the Parliament will want to push back a little bit on the kind of complete avoidance at the moment of giving users rights. But that's just where we sit at the moment. And as I say, do not panic, because the entire TAS governance hub is perfectly timed for the end of this debate to happen pretty much as we wind up with our last conference. I'll pass it back. To Daria.
Yes, I've seen some interesting questions. I think one question was, oh, now I can't open the chat. Just a second.
Oh, I can answer
okay.
Andy's question if you want. Did GDPR not give users teeth? It depends where you are, Andy. A lot of us have talked about the way in which the GDPR is used in different countries. If you're in Germany, yes, perhaps, as long as you're dealing with a company based in Germany. If you're in Ireland or Luxembourg, not so much. If you go to the Avenue de Rock and Roll in Luxembourg, which is where the Luxembourg regulator is, you will find there the 10 people who are assigned with regulating eBay and Amazon and every other company that claims to be based in Luxembourg. So yeah, the GDPR is much less effective in practice than the US Federal Trade Commission. And that is not actually even a controversial comment for those who follow the regulatory decision-making and the size of fines and so on.
So I guess in general, what anyone could answer it, what would be what's the aim of the legislation? I guess if people expected this would be something that would strengthen consumer and individual rights, and that's not really fulfilled. Is it, as in the question, is it just something to enhance the EU single market? Is that simply the purpose, or what are not necessarily the benefits of a risk-based approach, but do we need a rights-based approach in some instances? If someone wants to comment on that.
Burkhard will have views on that, I'm sure. I mean, it's certainly the case that it's a product liability approach at the moment. Lachlan, I don't think you'd say there's very much rights-based analysis that goes on in it as it stands.
Oh, no, it isn't. But what are the, is that necessarily the future we should go to, and with regard to the regulation of AI, or do we need more than that? So, because I guess the aim of this regulation would be to do something that is comprehensive and holistic.
I mean, I'm in two minds about that myself. There are certain advantages of having a product liability mindset in some ways. If you look at the European product liability law, that has been remarkably paternalistic in some ways. Certain things you can't opt out, you can't contract out. Unlike, one might say, the GDPR, where consent pretty much governs everything. So in a way, the product liability mindset is potentially a helpful addition, again, if one considers that all of these different regulations have to play together, and that just gives a specific type of flavor, which can be very protective. What I have a bigger problem with, if you like, is the evolving concept of a product. And that gets us back to some of the discussion that we had earlier on. We still think of the product as something that is complete, finished, put to the market, and then you forget about it. The whole mixed economy of hardware and software, we never quite got our head around, I think, from a legal perspective, which is embarrassing given how long they are around. So that would be my concern with it. As a liability regime, there are real advantages. I think in it, we also understand it well. We know how it works. The one question I have is how much do we have to adjust it to account, as we discussed earlier, for things that change constantly, get updates, change their function to a certain extent. What are the identity criteria for these things, for these products that are now regulated?
Lachlan is raising.
Yeah, no, it's just to say, I think what's interesting about the approach within the AI Act, I guess, is it's trying to meet a gap that's not there currently in terms of trying to demystify a lot of these technologies and to try and put in place, some of these good governance tools around, having the ability to have records in place in the first place, or try to kind of have record keeping and logs and all these kinds of different tools that the legislation tries to put in place. And I would wonder, I guess, from the right side, whether, given the existence of consumer rights, data protection rights, human rights, equality law frameworks, how much of a gap is there in terms of the coverage that they have at the moment? And if you look at things like the Bridges case in the UK around police use of live facial recognition in Wales, a lot of that turned on the data protection provisions, the human rights provisions under Article 8 privacy, and also the sort of the public sector equality duty that the police haven't done sufficiently well. So I think, yeah, there's sort of those existing frameworks that are there that could encapsulate some of the harms that we'd be worried about in terms of end user rights. And yeah, it'd be interesting to think about what's not covered under those existing frameworks. And yeah, would we need something complementary to add to the AI Act, or would we want to kind of roll it all into one piece of legislation, given this one's already trying to do so much in terms of targeting the providers, the users in terms of those who are deploying those AI systems, as opposed to those that are impacted by them, and the distributors. I don't know. It feels like there's a lot packed into it already. But yeah, this would be my take on it.
Alan, have a question? Yeah.
Yes, I'm following on from what Lachlan says, that suggests an approach to legislation, which is first to identify what aspects of AI systems aren't covered by existing legislation, and what's distinctive about them that needs something. And the only thing that I can think of at the moment, but I've only just given a few seconds thought to it, is the explainability aspect of machine learning system. So if the advice was being given by a human, one could ask them questions about how they came to that advice or diagnosis or whatever. And there's a real problem about doing that for machine learning systems, notwithstanding the Article 13 that you mentioned, which seemed to insist on it. So I can see possibility of legislation around such distinctive differences, but maybe they're few and far between.
Yes, are there any further questions? Because if not, then we could.
I think not a question, but partly in response to Alan. I mean that is for me one of the really interesting questions. What do we expect of an explanation? And what is the right and helpful explanation for a specific context? And I would say there's a massive difference, for instance, of the type of explanation I owe to people, either legally or at least ethically, if I think I was right and I explain it to them, like if I give a mark to a student and I justify it, versus an explanation where something already went wrong, and I explain after the event why it was wrong, why I might not be that bad a person as people thought, and why there were good reasons in a way for me of getting wrong. I would say they have a totally different logical structure. They use different types of facts, so that is already a big difference. And then again, there are big differences that are subject specific. So for instance, in the medical field, we have that duty of candor, where there are specific obligations on a medical doctor to explain a proposed course of treatment with all the risks to a patient, which do not exist necessarily in other fields, where we are allowed to take psychological vulnerability of the user more into account. So I think there is exactly as Andy says, a sort of understanding of what XAI means from a technological perspective matches only partially to the one that we require in law.
Now, just looking at the comment that Andy's put in the chat. So law does not expect machines to explain themselves, only that their outputs are interpretable by a human being. Is that right? Well, the question then is which human being? Because a lot of the explanation systems in machine learning are really aimed from the developer. You see, why the hell, it thought this penguin was an elephant or something, what bits were responsible for that, and so, but not really aimed at the person who's just been refused a mortgage or. I
was going to jump in there if I can, Alan, just in response. I know it's not my party, as it were, but and I'll let Lachlan pick it up. But I think from what I've read about it, the human oversight requirements of the AI Act are the things that impact us. Interestingly, so here. So who that person will be, it's not a developer.
No,
it's a user somehow, and those users can be anything from an ordinary citizen to some kind of skilled technician of some kind. And I don't mean developer technician, I mean another kind of technician, like the guy who's going to drop a bomb on somebody, but yeah, perhaps other people want to jump in there as well.
Stuart's got his hand up. Maybe he has it up by default.
Stuart, you're mute.
Just to say, by the way, the right to explanation is already in the GDPR to some extent. So,
yes.
So that's already there. And that's probably the thing to be more worried about in the next couple of years than anything that might or might not be in the AI Act. By the way, everyone should probably feel quite much more positive, much less negative about the UK government's kind of sponsorship as opposed to regulation of AI, now that you've heard that the AI Act itself is pretty toothless, at least as it's initially designed. So you realise the UK is less out of sync with the EU than might have been suspected.
Peter's got his hand up too, but he's
okay,
he's definitely muted.
Can you hear me now? Good. Okay. So I don't know. Somehow it's not picking up my camera microphone. I want to ask a question about risk analysis, and specifically, it seems like, I mean, the kind of health and safety approach to these things is always based around harm to the individual in some sense. But it seems like quite a lot of the concerns around AI, around, let's say, machine learning models are much more at a population level, and that actually doing risk analysis to some extent should involve some sort of analysis of the models in terms of how they deal with particular populations and whether they have characteristics, whether those subpopulations, if you like, would have characteristics that would be seen as being harmful if they were treated uniformly in somehow or another by the system. So I was just wondering whether there was much discussion about the refinement of risk analysis techniques to kind of try and take account of these sorts of machine learning systems. I mean, maybe Vaishak might want to say something about that, because in a sense, it's about explainability at the model level rather than at the individual decision level.
No. I think Vaishek's gone to make himself a cup of coffee.
Mhm. Sorry, I wasn't. I still sort of try to translate it, but I might have to get back to you on that, because also the answer might get way beyond what we have allocated as time. We are already a bit over. But that is a question that I think pops up in different parts of the Act and might then have repercussions for the explainability side, but falls under a different section for which we also don't quite know what is expected.
Peter's got his hand up.
Yeah, so it was just several quick comments. The one about explanation or explainability doesn't seem to me to be a difference in AI systems with respect to the law, and you either have an obligation or you don't to be able to explain things. But it did seem to me one of the areas that I've noticed regulation being used is effectively cutting down the rights by the fact that it creates situations in which you need to be able to do things where previously there was a universal obligation to be able to do these things. So I didn't hear anybody exploring that kind of stuff that went with that one. The other one, or second point, was in the discussions about AI systems. AI appears at multiple places in multiple levels of systems that are ephemerally joined together in order to achieve things. And one of the aspects of health and safety legislation is you get a joint and several liability, which you then try and thrash out between you, but you're all liable until such time as we work out whose fault it was. That kind of stuff I would expect to permeate into AI systems, because we're not giving them a way of doing that. And if we answer things incorrectly, in terms of the regulations and the advice that we give, we would appear to give we would appear to give either a limitation that isn't there, or make life extremely difficult. You had a thing earlier on where you talked about the law in relation to things, and I'm conscious I sent it to Ram instead of everyone. But the other area we're seeing as being particularly powerful on the law is the misleading the financial markets. Companies borrow money in order to do things. If you borrow money to do things that you're not able to do, which is what happened on the Dieselgate stuff, then you end up being responsible for misleading. That tends to be criminal offences, and I know it's generally left out. I expect to see those in the AI case as well, as being quite significant areas of prosecution. So misleading people about what you're actually doing. I'll put my hand down.
Ram, do you want us to move on?
Yeah, I think that's a good point to move on. I didn't want to cut